Welcome to Family Revenge Secrets, a place where true stories of family, sacrifice, and betrayal are shared so that none of us feels alone in the struggles behind closed doors. If you believe in courage, in truth, and in the power of family, I invite you to subscribe. Every story here carries a light, sometimes dim, sometimes blazing, that may one day guide you through your own darkest nights. My name is Margaret Hill. I turned 50 last fall. I have silver strands in my hair, laugh lines etched deep on my face, and a heart that has lived both joy and loss. 10 years ago, I buried my husband, Paul. He had been my high school sweetheart, the man who worked 3 jobs to put food on the table, and the father who tucked our boys into bed with the same tenderness I now try to give my grandson. Since his passing, this house in suburban Ohio has been my refuge and my burden. It is a modest 2-story home with sun-faded curtains and a porch that creaks when you step on it. But it holds my world, my eldest son Michael, his wife Emily, and their 7-year-old boy Ethan. Ethan's laughter fills the silence left by his grandfather. His drawings cover the fridge. And Emily, beautiful, poised, the daughter-in-law I thought heaven had sent me, has been the glue holding our dinners together. At least, that's what I believed. Then came the call. It was a Tuesday morning, quiet except for the hum of the dishwasher and the tick of the old kitchen clock. Michael had already left for work, his blueprints tucked under his arm. Ethan was off to school, his backpack bouncing as he climbed onto the yellow bus. And Emily had just called out from upstairs, her voice sweet as honey. "Mom, I'll take a quick shower before I run to the store." "Of course, dear," I answered, folding the dish towel and smiling at how settled our life seemed. That's when the phone rang. I reached for the receiver, pressing it to my ear. "Hello? Mom," a familiar voice came through, warm at first. It was Daniel, my younger son, my pride, the one who had chased his dream of flying and now worked as a co-pilot for a major airline. Hearing him always made me smile. "Danny, what a surprise. Where are you calling from?" "I'm at the airport," he said, his tone light. "A layover between flights. Just wanted to hear your voice." I laughed, picturing him in his crisp uniform, the same boy who once made paper airplanes and swore he'd touch the clouds someday. For a few moments, we spoke of nothing. His schedule, my roses in the garden, the way Ethan had drawn an airplane just yesterday and labeled it Uncle Danny's jet. Then his voice shifted. It dropped almost into a whisper. "Mom, something's strange. Emily's at the house, isn't she?" "Yes, of course," I said, glancing toward the ceiling where the shower was still running. "She's upstairs. Why?" Daniel was silent, too silent. I could hear the faint bustle of the terminal behind him, the distant announcement of boarding calls. Then he spoke again, his voice tight. "That's impossible, Mom. I just watched Emily board my flight. She handed her passport to the attendant and I'm holding it in my hand right now." My heart jolted. "You must be mistaken, sweetheart. She just went upstairs." But before I could finish, I heard it. The water stopped. Footsteps creaked across the hallway. And then, clear as day, Emily's voice drifted down. "Margaret, is that someone for me?" I nearly dropped the phone. My throat went dry. "Danny," I whispered into the receiver. "She's here. She just called to me." On the other end, his breath caught. "Mom, I'm telling you, she's also here, in front of me. In seat 3A, talking to a man who looks like he stepped out of a magazine." The room spun. My knees wobbled and I clutched the counter for balance. I looked toward the staircase, where a shadow moved, where the woman I had lived with, trusted, and loved like a daughter now stood, towel in hand, smiling as if nothing in the world were wrong. And yet, across an ocean-bound jet, my son claimed she sat sipping champagne beside another man. 2 Emilys, 1 house, 1 plane, and a mother caught in the middle of an impossible truth. That night I could not sleep. The tick of the clock became thunder in my ears. What if Daniel was right? What if the woman in my house wasn't who I thought she was? I have always believed a mother's role is to notice the little things, the bruise hidden by a child's sleeve, the unshed tear behind a forced smile, the lies spoken softly so the family won't unravel. That day, I realized I had been blind. Because somewhere between the upstairs shower and an international flight, my family's story had split in two. And I, Margaret Hill, widow, mother, grandmother, was about to discover a truth that would shake every corner of this house. I stood frozen in the kitchen, the receiver still trembling in my hand, Emily's soft voice lingering in the air like a ghost. Daniel's words echoed against the walls of my chest. She's here. She's on the plane. I'm looking at her right now. For a moment, I thought I might faint. But then the sound of cabinets opening, the clink of a cup on the counter, brought me back. Emily padded into the kitchen, her hair damp, her smile easy. "Coffee?" she asked. "You look pale, Margaret." I forced a nod. "Yes, thank you." She poured me a cup, placed it gently in front of me, and carried on with her morning as though nothing were amiss. I sipped, though my lips were dry. I said nothing more to Daniel, only whispered that I loved him before setting the phone back on the hook. The day unfolded as it always did, tidy, predictable, like clockwork, but inside me the gears had shifted. Life in our house was a tapestry woven from routines. Michael rose early, always with dark circles under his eyes, always with another blueprint tucked into his satchel. He was steady, dependable, too serious for a man of 35, but I knew it came from carrying the weight of being the man of the house since his father died. Ethan bounded down the stairs each morning with his lopsided grin, his cowlick refusing to be tamed no matter how many times I wet it with my palm. His shoes were never tied, his backpack never zipped, but his laughter filled every corner like sunlight. And then there was Emily. Elegant in the way she carried herself, deliberate in her kindness, attentive to the smallest things. She noticed when my knees ached after tending the roses, when Michael needed tea to soothe his late-night cough, when Ethan's socks didn't match and he'd be teased at school. She fit herself into our lives as though she had always been there. To me, Emily was more than a daughter-in-law. She was the daughter I never had. I often thanked God for her, in quiet prayers whispered over folded laundry or in the stillness of dawn before the house stirred awake. That morning, as she stood humming softly while chopping vegetables for dinner, I almost convinced myself Daniel must have been mistaken. Airports were hectic. People resembled one another. Perhaps fatigue had clouded his eyes. And yet, unease coiled in my stomach like smoke. After Michael left for the office, I lingered on the porch, watching the school bus carry Ethan away, his small hand pressed to the window until the bus turned the corner. I remembered doing the same with Daniel when he was Ethan's age, back when Paul still stood beside me, strong and certain. 10 years a widow. 10 years of patching this family together with threadbare patience and endless prayer. I had given up things most women my age clung to: friends, evenings out, even small indulgences like new clothes. My life was poured wholly into theirs. Michael's career, Ethan's innocence, Emily's comfort. Some people say sacrifice makes you invisible. Maybe it does. Maybe that's why no one asked if I was lonely, why no one noticed the ache in my chest when I sat at the empty side of the bed each night. But I didn't mind. Love was enough. Love was the kind of currency that grew interest the more you gave it away. Still, as I sat there, Daniel's whisper pressed against me like an unanswered prayer. By afternoon, the house grew quiet again. I folded laundry at the kitchen table. Michael's pressed shirts, Ethan's grass-stained jeans, Emily's blouses that smelled faintly of lavender. Each piece of fabric felt like part of my duty, small offerings in the altar of family. The ticking clock on the wall measured the silence. With each second, the morning phone call replayed. Emily humming upstairs. Emily boarding a flight. Both true, yet impossible. I tried to brush it aside, convincing myself it was nothing. Families survive by ignoring the small things, after all. We swallow strange words, overlook odd looks, pretend not to notice the cracks so the walls stay standing. But later that evening, when Ethan pulled out his homework and asked Emily to help him write the alphabet, I noticed something that made my heart clench. She held the pencil in her left hand. I blinked. I had seen her write countless grocery lists, sign school forms, pen little notes on sticky pads for Michael, and always with her right. Tonight, though, she wrote slowly, awkwardly, each letter crooked like a child's. Ethan didn't seem to mind, he only laughed when she ruffled his hair. But I sat there, pretending to mend a button, my fingers stiff. My mind whispered, Daniel wasn't wrong. That night, after everyone was asleep, I slipped into the kitchen and opened my drawer where I kept old recipe cards. I pulled out a small spiral notebook, its cover frayed from years of shopping lists and reminders. And with a trembling hand, I wrote my first line. Tuesday morning, Emily upstairs. Daniel swears she boarded his flight. The words looked stark against the page, real, heavy. I closed the notebook, pressed it to my chest, and whispered into the empty room. Paul, if you were here, what would you see? What would you believe? The house answered with silence, the kind that makes you realize how fragile an ordinary life really is. The next morning began like any other. Sunlight streamed through the lace curtains, spilling across the kitchen floor. Ethan bounded down the stairs with his backpack, chattering about a drawing contest at school. Emily followed behind, her hair tied neatly, her blouse pressed, the picture of composure. She kissed Ethan's forehead, poured him a glass of orange juice, and reminded him to eat his toast. A scene so ordinary, so comforting, it almost made me forget the notebook tucked away in the drawer and the words I had written in it the night before. Almost. When Ethan left for school and Michael disappeared into the fog of his commute, Emily lingered in the kitchen. She hummed softly while rinsing dishes. I busied myself with sweeping, pretending not to stare. But when she reached for the sponge, I froze. She used her left hand again. Not awkwardly this time, but with ease, as if it had always been her dominant hand. I blinked. Yesterday's crooked handwriting could have been fatigue, but this was fluid, natural. My heart knocked against my ribs. Emily, I said, steadying my voice, weren't you always right-handed? She turned, startled, then gave a quick laugh. I can use both, ambidextrous, you know? Comes in handy when Ethan hides my pens. She smiled, light-hearted, and went back to scrubbing the pan. I tried to return her smile, but inside, unease grew like a shadow stretching across the floor. That afternoon, I stepped outside to trim the rose bushes. Mrs. Collins, our neighbor of 20 years, leaned over the fence with her usual friendly grin. Margaret, she said, your daughter-in-law brought me a plate of cookies yesterday. Such a sweetheart. I nodded. That sounds like her. But something struck me as odd, she added, lowering her voice. She handed me the plate with her left hand. I always thought she was right-handed. Didn't you say that once? My pruning shears slipped, nearly cutting my finger. Yes, I murmured, forcing a smile. Maybe she's just practicing. Mrs. Collins shrugged, unconcerned, but her words echoed in my mind long after she walked away. That evening, while Michael worked late at his drafting table upstairs, Emily helped Ethan with his homework at the kitchen table. I hovered in the doorway, folding dish towels, pretending not to eavesdrop. Write carefully, sweetheart, she told him, guiding his hand. Ethan frowned. But yesterday your writing was prettier, Mom. Today it looks messy. He held up 2 pages of his notebook. On one, the letters were neat and rounded. On the other, jagged and crooked. Emily laughed too quickly. Maybe I was tired today, Ethan. She kissed the top of his head and closed the book. I gripped the towel tighter, the fabric twisting in my hands. My grandson's innocent observation had struck where my doubts already lived. Later that week, I went to Mr. Johnson's bakery, as I always did on Thursdays. He handed me a bag of sweet rolls and said, your daughter-in-law stopped by yesterday morning. Lovely woman. She told me how much Ethan loves my bread. I smiled. That sounds like Emily. He hesitated, scratching his head. Strange thing though, she came back this morning. Same blouse, same basket, but this time she barely looked at me. Didn't say a word, just paid and left. Thought maybe she was upset. The bag slipped in my hands. Oh, I managed. She must have been in a hurry. I hurried home, my mind spinning. 2 Emilys, one kind, one cold, one graceful, one abrupt. That night at dinner, Ethan spilled his glass of milk, the white liquid spreading across the tablecloth. "It's okay, sweetheart," I said quickly, grabbing a rag, but Emily's face hardened. "Ethan, you're too old to be this careless." Her voice was sharp, a tone I had never heard from her before. Michael looked up from his plate, frowning. "Emily, it was an accident, don't be so harsh." Her eyes flashed. "You always defend him, Michael, you make me the villain." The room went silent. Ethan's lower lip quivered as he stared at his plate. I reached out and wrapped an arm around him, whispering, "It's all right, honey." But inside, my stomach churned. This was not the Emily I knew. That night, after everyone had gone to bed, I returned to my notebook. My hand shook as I wrote. Thursday, Emily scolded Ethan harshly, out of character. Bakery owner says she visited twice in same clothes, different moods, handwriting inconsistent, left hand again. I closed the notebook, my chest heavy. Sacrifice is often invisible, I reminded myself. A mother notices, absorbs, endures. But now, what I was noticing was not just exhaustion or mood. It was something deeper, something I couldn't name. The cracks in my family's mirror were widening, and I was the only one who saw them. The following week, spring settled over our street. Daffodils popped through the soil, the air smelled faintly of cut grass, and children left chalk drawings on the sidewalks. Life looked ordinary, but in my chest, the storm was building. The cracks I had been recording in my little notebook no longer felt like harmless quirks. They were becoming a chorus of dissonant notes, and every voice around me seemed to join in. On Monday afternoon, I waited at the curb for Ethan's school bus. Mrs. Collins came out to water her tulips, waving cheerfully. "Margaret," she called, "your Emily is such a dear. She stopped by yesterday, asked about my arthritis, even brought over a jar of soup." I nodded, smiling politely. That sounded like Emily, the warm, attentive daughter-in-law I cherished. But then Mrs. Collins tilted her head. Funny thing, though, this morning she passed me on the street, basket in hand. I said hello twice, but she kept walking like she didn't even hear me. Not a smile, not a word. The smile on my face faltered. Maybe she was distracted, I murmured. Mrs. Collins shrugged. "We all get distracted, but it felt like 2 different people, you know?" She laughed lightly and returned to her tulips. I clutched Ethan's backpack when he bounded off the bus, my heart heavy. The whispers didn't stop there. At the grocery store, Murray Jenkins, the vegetable vendor who had known me for decades, caught my arm. "Mrs. Hill, is Emily doing all right?" she asked. I stiffened. "Why do you ask?" "Well, last week she came by all smiles, telling me about a new recipe she wanted to try. She even asked about my kids. But just 2 days later, she came again and looked right through me like we'd never spoken. I asked if she wanted cilantro, and she just shook her head without even looking up. I forced a laugh. She's probably just busy. Marie didn't look convinced. Busy, maybe, but it felt off. That evening, Ethan sat at the kitchen table coloring. He held up 2 pages proudly. "Grandma, look. Yesterday Mom drew a butterfly for me, and today she drew another one. See?" I leaned in. One butterfly was delicate, the lines even, the wings symmetrical. The other was jagged, lopsided, as though drawn by an entirely different hand. Ethan frowned. "Why does Mom draw different every day? Sometimes she hugs me really tight, and other times she doesn't even look at me." I swallowed hard, my throat dry. Maybe she's tired, sweetheart. Grown-ups get tired sometimes. But Ethan's innocent eyes pierced me. I like the mom from yesterday better. I hugged him, blinking back tears. Out of the mouths of children come truths we cannot hide from. The next morning, I stopped by Johnson's bakery again. Mr. Johnson leaned across the counter, lowering his voice. "Margaret, is everything okay with Emily? She came in twice this week." The first time, she told me Ethan loved my cinnamon rolls. She was cheerful, kind. The second time, just yesterday, she barely looked at me, paid for the bread and walked out without so much as a thank you. I thought maybe I had upset her. I forced a smile, though my hands trembled around the paper bag. "No, Joe, you didn't upset her. She's just under pressure." But when I walked home, the truth pressed on me harder than the sun. Even the neighbors, even the shopkeepers, people who had no reason to imagine things, had noticed what I was trying so hard not to admit. That evening, Michael was late again. The house was quiet, just Emily and me in the kitchen while Ethan did his math homework. Emily chopped carrots for stew, her left hand steady on the knife. "Did you talk to Mrs. Collins today?" she asked casually, as if testing me. I looked up, startled. "Why?" "She waved at me this morning, but I didn't feel like talking. I'm sure she ran straight to you afterward. That woman notices everything." Her tone was sharp, her smile brittle. I forced my voice calm. "She only said she worries about you, dear." Emily set the knife down harder than she meant to, the blade clattering against the cutting board. "People should mind their own business." The room went silent. Even Ethan seemed to sense the tension, glancing between us. That night, when I tucked Ethan into bed, he whispered, "Grandma, sometimes I feel like I have two moms. One is nice, one is mean. Which one is real?" My heart cracked. I stroked his hair, forcing a smile. "The real one loves you very much, Ethan. Don't forget that." But as I kissed his forehead and closed his bedroom door, I pressed my back against the wall and let the tears fall. I went to the kitchen, opened the drawer, and pulled out my notebook. Monday, I wrote, "Mrs. Collins says Emily was kind one day, cold the next. Marie noticed the same. Mr. Johnson, too. Ethan says it feels like he has two mothers." The ink blurred as my hand shook. The whispers of the neighborhood had become my own whispers, echoing louder each day. Something is wrong. Something is terribly wrong. And I was the only one willing to listen. The whispers would not leave me. They circled my head at night like restless birds, pecking at my sleep, making every shadow in the hallway look suspicious. By Friday, I could no longer pretend. My hands shook when I made coffee. I forgot to salt the soup. Even Ethan, who usually noticed nothing except his toys, frowned at me. "Grandma, are you sick?" he asked, his small hand tugging at my sleeve. "No, sweetheart," I lied, stroking his hair. "Just tired." But tired wasn't the word. I was consumed. That afternoon, Emily announced she was going to the market. She wore a pale yellow blouse I hadn't seen before, and she carried the wicker basket she always took on her errands. "I'll be back in a couple of hours," she said lightly, kissing Ethan on the forehead. "Be good for Grandma." The front gate closed behind her, and I stood rooted in the living room, my heart pounding. A voice inside me whispered, "Follow her." I hesitated. It felt wrong, sneaking after my daughter-in-law like some spy in my own neighborhood. But the image of Ethan's wide, confused eyes, "Which mom is real?" pushed me forward. I grabbed my old shawl, draped it around my shoulders, and stepped out quietly. Emily walked briskly down the familiar cobblestone street that led to the market. I followed at a careful distance, keeping to the shadows, my pulse racing with every step. But then, instead of turning right toward Main Street, she veered left into an alley I had never seen her use. My breath caught. The alley was narrow, lined with weathered houses that leaned into one another as if exhausted. Paint peeled from the walls. Laundry hung limply from sagging lines. The air smelled faintly of rust and damp earth. Emily walked with purpose, never glancing back. I ducked behind a fence, my fingers gripping the wood so tightly splinters bit my skin. At last, she stopped in front of a small house with a cracked wooden door and faded curtains. She knocked softly, almost tenderly, before slipping inside. The door closed, leaving me trembling on the sidewalk. For several minutes, I couldn't move. My mind screamed questions. Who lived there? Why had she gone? And why the secrecy, the detour away from the familiar path? Finally, I forced my legs to carry me closer. The house looked nothing like ours, its porch sagged, its windows cloudy with grime. A wilted plant sat on the sill, long forgotten. I raised my hand to knock, but before I could, the door cracked open, and my heart stopped. Standing before me was Emily, or rather the image of Emily, her face, her dark hair, her stature. But something was different. Her eyes darted nervously, her hands twisted a rag she held, and her clothes were plain, almost shabby. She froze when she saw me. "Emily?" I whispered, though even as I spoke, I knew something was wrong. The woman shook her head quickly, her voice trembled. "I'm not Emily. My name is Isabella." The world tilted. I staggered back a step, clutching the doorframe. You look exactly like her." "I know." Tears welled in her eyes. "I never meant for you to find out." Her voice cracked, and for a moment she looked like a frightened child. Behind her, the shadow of another woman appeared, older, with kind eyes and a steady gaze. "Don't hide, Isabella," the older woman said gently. It's time she knew the truth. She turned to me and extended a hand. "My name is Lucy. Please come inside." The house smelled faintly of disinfectant and old wood. The floor creaked beneath my feet. In one corner, an old man coughed weakly on a cot, his frail body covered with a thin blanket. I lowered myself into a wooden chair, my knees trembling. Isabella sat across from me, her face pale, her hands still wringing the rag. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I'm not your daughter-in-law. I never was." I stared at her, words caught in my throat. "Then who are you? Why do you look like her?" Isabella lowered her eyes. "I don't know the whole story. All I know is Emily found me. She said I looked just like her, and she offered me money, more than I could ever imagine, to pretend, to take her place sometimes, to go to the market, to be in the house, to cover for her." I felt the room spin. "Cover for her?" I repeated, my voice sharp with disbelief. "Cover what?" Isabella's shoulders shook as tears slid down her cheeks. "I never asked. I needed the money. My parents are sick. Medicine is expensive. I thought I was helping my family." She buried her face in her hands. Lucy placed a steady hand on her shoulder. "She's telling the truth, Mrs. Hill. Isabella is poor, desperate. Your daughter-in-law took advantage of that desperation." My mind reeled, the left hand, the sharp moods, the neighbors noticing two Emilys, Ethan's innocent words. Two women, one life. I pressed a trembling hand to my chest, the notebook in my mind filling with more than I could bear to write. Across from me sat a girl who looked like the daughter-in-law I thought I knew, yet carried none of her grace. Just fear, just regret. And in that moment, I realized the truth. The cracks in my family's mirror weren't cracks at all. They were reflections. Two Emilys, one in my home, one in this alley, and me, caught between them, wondering how much more of my family's life was a lie. I sat in that narrow room, the air heavy with disinfectant and grief, while Isabella's tears fell onto the rag twisted in her lap. My hands clutched the arms of the wooden chair, and I could feel my late husband's absence like a hollow in my chest. How I wished Paul were beside me, steadying me with his calm voice. Across from me, Isabella's resemblance to Emily was undeniable. Her cheekbones, the slope of her jaw, the same deep brown eyes. And yet, everything about her was softer, wearier, stripped of the polish Emily wore like armor. "You're telling me," I began slowly, "that my daughter-in-law pays you to step into her life to be her?" Isabella nodded, her shoulders trembling. "She asked me to go to your house sometimes. To cook, to smile, to pick up Ethan from school. She said it would only be for short hours, and she paid me enough to buy my father's medicine." My chest tightened. Ethan, my sweet grandson, only 7 years old, had been embraced by this woman, sung to sleep by her, confused by her. How many nights had he whispered, "I like the other mom better," not knowing his little heart had already sensed what the rest of us ignored. Why would Emily do this? I asked, my voice low, each word dragging. Isabella shook her head. I never asked. She told me it was none of my business. She just said she needed time away. She would leave me in her place, and when she returned, she would hand me the money in cash. I never wanted to deceive anyone. I only wanted to keep my parents alive. Lucy, the older woman, spoke then, her voice clear as church bells. You should know something, Mrs. Hill. Isabella's story doesn't begin with Emily's schemes. It begins long before that. I turned to her, my breath caught. What do you mean? Lucy's gaze softened. She reached for a stack of worn papers from the dresser, her fingers careful. Reverend, Isabella was adopted. Her mother, well, the woman who raised her, was a nurse at a county hospital many years ago. She told me that one night, a young mother gave birth to twins. The family was too poor, too desperate. They said they could only keep one child. My heart stilled. The nurse couldn't stand to watch the other baby abandoned, Lucy continued. So she took her home. That baby was Isabella. The words rang in the room like a verdict. Twins, two children born together, torn apart by circumstance. And suddenly, the impossible made sense. The mirrored faces, the shifting hands, the two Emilys seen by neighbors on the same day. I gripped the edge of the table, my voice cracking. Are you saying Emily and Isabella are sisters, that they are? Twin sisters, Lucy finished quietly. Separated at birth. Isabella's sobs deepened. She covered her face, ashamed. I never knew until I met her. The first time was at a market. She dropped her basket, and when I bent to help her, we froze. It was like looking in a mirror. She smiled, asked my name. Days later, she returned with an offer to pretend to be her when she needed me. I didn't question it. I was too stunned by the resemblance and too desperate for the money. My stomach turned. Emily, my trusted daughter-in-law, the woman I had welcomed into my home, had not only hidden a secret life but exploited her own flesh and blood. Why didn't she tell you the truth? I asked Isabella softly. She never admitted it outright, Isabella whispered. But I knew. Every time she looked at me, it was as if she was staring at her own reflection. Once I asked her, are we sisters? She laughed coldly and said, don't get ideas, you're just useful to me. The cruelty of it cut through me. I thought of Ethan, bewildered by the two versions of his mother, craving affection one day and shrinking from her harshness the next. I thought of Michael, buried in work, blind to the cracks spreading in his marriage. And I thought of Daniel, holding a passport on the jet bridge, watching Emily sit beside another man while her ghost moved through my house. I whispered into the silence, how could she do this to her own family? No one answered. The old man on the cot coughed weakly, as if reminding us that desperation can make monsters of people we think we know. I rose to my feet, my knees unsteady. I need to go, I said, though my voice shook. I need to think. Isabella stood too, her face streaked with tears. Mrs. Hill, I never meant to hurt you. Please believe me. I only wanted to save my parents. If I could undo it all, I would. I looked at her closely then. Despite the lies, despite the deception, there was sincerity in her eyes and a softness Emily's gaze had long since lost. For a moment, I felt the pull of maternal instinct, not toward Emily, the daughter-in-law I had cherished, but toward Isabella, the girl who had been cast aside and then used again. I believe you, I whispered. I stepped into the sunlight outside, the afternoon air heavy with the scent of fried onions from a nearby window. I walked back toward my home, my shawl pulled tight around me, my mind a storm of questions. Two sisters, one life stolen, one life wasted. And me, a mother, trying to protect the child who had already lost too much. As I reached my gate, I saw Emily through the kitchen window, her hair tied back neatly, her smile sweet as she stirred a pot on the stove. If I had not seen the alley, if I had not met Isabella, I might have believed the lie again. But now I knew, and knowledge, once found, is impossible to return. When I walked back into my kitchen that evening, Emily looked up from the stove, her smile warm and practiced. You're back. I made stew your favorite. The smell of carrots and beef filled the air, comforting and familiar. For a fleeting moment, I almost let myself believe the lie again. But the memory of Isabella's tear-streaked face in that dim alley house pressed against me like a hand on my chest. I sat at the table, watching Emily ladle stew into bowls, her every gesture calm, controlled. She looked so much like the girl I once believed she was, the devoted wife, the tender mother, the daughter I never had. And yet all I could see was her shadow. That night after dinner, Michael went upstairs to finish a project for work. Ethan ran off to build forts out of couch cushions. I lingered in the kitchen, rinsing dishes beside Emily. "Busy week?" I asked, my tone casual. She shrugged. "Errands, friends, you know." I looked at her closely. Her eyes flicked away too quickly, as though the word friends carried a weight she didn't want me to notice. Later, when she thought I was asleep, I heard the creak of the front door. I rose quietly, peering through the curtains. Emily, dressed in a neat coat, hurried down the street under the glow of the streetlights. She turned left, not toward the market, but in the direction of downtown. My heart pounded. I didn't follow this time. I only watched until she vanished into the night. The next morning, Daniel called again. His voice was taut with urgency. "Mom, I saw her again. On your flight?" "Yes," she boarded with a man, expensive suit, silver cufflinks. They sat together, first class, the way they talked like lovers. "I swear it, Mom." My stomach nodded. "Did you hear his name?" Daniel hesitated. I caught a glimpse when they handed passports to the attendant. His was embossed with gold initials, CT, and when the stewardess greeted him, she called him Mr. Thompson. The name echoed through me. "Thompson?" "Mom," Daniel said firmly, "she isn't who you think she is. She's living another life." I whispered his name, afraid Emily might hear. "Danny, promise me you'll keep your eyes open. Write down everything you see." He promised, and when I hung up, I found my hands shaking so badly I almost dropped the receiver. That afternoon, while Ethan napped, I stepped outside to clear my head. Mrs. Jenkins, the vegetable vendor, waved me over at the market corner. "Margaret," she said gently, "I hope you don't mind me saying this, but yesterday I saw your Emily at the cafe on Main Street. She wasn't alone. She was with a man. Tall, well-dressed, hair slicked back. They were sitting very close. She called him Charles." The name lodged in me like a stone. Charles Thompson. Mrs. Jenkins continued, lowering her voice. "They looked intimate, not like in-laws or friends, more than that. I didn't want to upset you, but it didn't look right." I thanked her, though my throat was so dry I could barely speak. I walked home with my basket heavy on my arm, the weight not from vegetables but from the truth pressing harder with each step. That evening, I couldn't keep still. While Emily tucked Ethan into bed, I slipped into her room. I knew it was wrong, but desperation has a way of stripping away propriety. In her dresser, beneath folded scarves, I found a small envelope. Inside was a receipt from an upscale restaurant downtown, 2 entrees, a bottle of imported wine. The date matched the night I saw her slip out of the house. The signature at the bottom was hers, curling and elegant. I pressed the receipt to my chest, tears stinging my eyes. Paul's voice came back to me, steady as stone. "The truth will set you free, Margaret, but it will also break you first." The next day, Emily breezed through the house with her usual composure, humming as she packed Ethan's lunch. But her eyes betrayed something, an energy almost giddy like a woman living 2 lives. I sat in the corner, notebook open on my lap, writing, "Name Charles Thompson, seen with Emily at cafe. Daniel confirms on flight, receipt found in dresser." The words bled across the page, heavy with betrayal. That weekend, Michael returned late from work, shoulders slumped, eyes weary. As he kissed Emily's cheek, she smiled faintly but didn't linger. She turned away too quickly, her mind elsewhere. Later, as Michael worked in his study, I found myself in the living room with Ethan curled against me. He whispered sleepily, "Grandma, Mommy smells different sometimes. Like flowers, I don't know, not the soap we use here." Tears pricked my eyes. Out of the mouths of children comes the truth no one else dares speak. That night, I stood at the window again, watching Emily leave. The streetlight cast her shadow long and thin against the pavement. I didn't follow. I didn't need to, because I knew now where she was going. And I knew who was waiting for her. The lover's shadow had finally stepped into the light. I knew the storm could no longer be held back. The whispers had grown into voices, the cracks into chasms. If I didn't speak, my silence would become complicity, so I decided to set the table. That Saturday evening, I laid a white cloth across the dining table, smoothing its creases with hands that trembled. I lit 2 candles, their flames bending with the faint draft from the window. The scent of roasted chicken and herbs filled the room, the same dish Paul used to love. I wanted it to look like a celebration, though in truth it was a reckoning. Michael arrived first, exhausted, his eyes heavy but hopeful at the sight of a warm meal. Ethan followed, bouncing in excitement at the sight of candles. "Grandma, are we celebrating?" he asked. "In a way," I whispered, kissing the crown of his head. Emily entered last, her hair curled, her perfume subtle but foreign to me. She looked surprised at the setting, but quickly masked it with a smile. "What's the occasion?" Before I could answer, the front door opened again. Daniel stepped in, his pilot's uniform pressed, his expression grave, and behind him, hovering in the doorway, was Isabella, her face pale, her eyes wide like a ghost summoned to life. The room fell silent. Ethan blinked, his little mouth forming the question none of us were ready to answer. "Why are there 2 moms?" The word struck the room like lightning. Michael dropped his fork. Emily froze, her face draining of color. "Sit down, Emily," I said softly but firmly. "We need to talk." Her eyes darted from me to Isabella, to Daniel standing stiff at her side. "What is this?" she demanded. "What are you trying to do?" Daniel placed a folder on the table with a thud. "These are your flight records, your passport stamps, proof you were in Paris when you were supposed to be here." Emily's lips pressed thin. "This is ridiculous." I opened my notebook, its pages filled with months of scribbles. My voice shook but did not falter. "You scolded Ethan one day and sang him to sleep the next. You drew butterflies with 2 different hands. You wore the same blouse but behaved like 2 different women. Neighbors saw you kind one day, cold the next. I wrote it all down, Emily. I am not imagining things." Isabella's tears fell as she whispered. "I told her the truth, Mrs. Hill. I couldn't carry the lie anymore." Michael's face turned toward his wife, confusion etched deep. "Emily, is this true? Who is she? Why does she look exactly like you?" Emily rose abruptly, her chair scraping the floor. "She's nothing," she snapped. "Just some girl who wanted money. She pretended, that's all." But Isabella's voice, trembling yet clear, cut through. "We're sisters, twins, you knew from the moment we met." The room gasped in its silence. Michael's hands balled into fists. "Sisters?" Emily glared, her composure cracking. "Fine, yes, she's my twin. She was abandoned, I was kept, but she means nothing to me." "And Charles Thompson?" Daniel's voice was sharp. Emily flinched. Michael's face went pale. "Who is Charles?" Her eyes hardened, defiance flashing. "Someone who actually gives me the life I deserve. Not this house, not this tired family, not this endless grind. With Charles, I have luxury, freedom, respect." Her words shattered against us like glass. Ethan's small voice trembled, tears brimming. "But Mommy, don't you love me?" The silence that followed was unbearable. Emily's lips parted, but no words came. So I pulled Ethan into my arms, holding him close as his sobs soaked my blouse. "You are loved, my darling," I whispered. "You are loved more than you'll ever know." Michael rose slowly, his face ashen, his body trembling. "All these years, I thought we were building a life together, and all the while you were lying to me, using your own sister, betraying your own son." Emily looked at him with cold eyes. "You'll never understand. You're small. He offers me the world." "Then go," Michael said, his voice breaking. "Go and take your world, but don't come back here." The words hung heavy in the air, final and devastating. Emily looked around once more, the flickering candles, the family photos on the wall, Ethan clutching me as though I were the only anchor left. For a moment, I thought she might soften, that some fragment of the woman I once believed in would return. But she only lifted her chin, turned, and walked out the door. The slam echoed like thunder, leaving behind only the sputtering of the candles and the sound of Ethan's quiet sobs. We sat in silence, broken pieces scattered around us. Michael stood there, trembling, his eyes wet but his jaw set. Daniel placed a hand on his shoulder. Isabella wept quietly in the corner, shame and sorrow blending in her tears. And I, Margaret Hill, mother, widow, guardian of what remained, held my grandson tight, whispering prayers into his hair, praying that this house, though shaken, might still find a way to stand. Because storms pass. But families, if they are brave enough, can survive even the cruelest truths. The night Emily left, silence fell over the house like ash after a fire. The candles on the table flickered until they burned down to nothing. None of us spoke. None of us moved. Ethan had cried himself to sleep against my chest, his tiny body trembling with sobs. I carried him to his room, tucked him beneath the covers, and kissed his damp cheek. His eyes fluttered open just long enough to whisper, "Grandma, don't let her go." "I won't let you be alone, sweetheart," I whispered back, though we both knew the truth. His mother had already chosen another life. In the days that followed, Michael moved like a man underwater. He went to work, came home, ate little, spoke less. Sometimes he sat on the edge of his bed, staring at the wall as though waiting for Emily to return. I heard him in the night, the quiet sound of a man trying not to break. Daniel flew back to his base after a few days, his embrace lingering before he left. "I'll call you, Mom," he promised. "But keep an eye on Michael, he's carrying too much." That left me, just me to hold this family together. One morning, Ethan shuffled into the kitchen with his hair sticking up and his eyes still heavy with sleep. He climbed onto the chair and asked, "Grandma, will Mommy come back today?" I knelt beside him, brushing the hair from his forehead. "I don't know, darling, but I promise you this, I will always be here. You'll never be without love." He studied my face as though testing the weight of my promise. Then he leaned into me, whispering, "You smell like safety." Tears stung my eyes as I hugged him close. Children have a way of speaking truths we didn't know we needed. Neighbors came by with casseroles and awkward condolences. Mrs. Collins brought a pie, her eyes soft with pity. "Margaret, you're stronger than anyone I know," she said. I smiled politely, but inside I felt anything but strong. At night, after Ethan was asleep, I sat at the kitchen table with my notebook open, staring at the scribbles that had led us here. The pages felt like scars, each line a wound reopened. I wanted to tear it up, to burn it in the fireplace, but I couldn't. It was proof. Proof that I hadn't been blind, proof that a mother's instinct, no matter how painful, was right. Isabella began to appear quietly at the edges of our lives. At first, she came to return the borrowed basket Emily had once carried. Then she brought soup when she heard Ethan had a cold. Ethan eyed her warily the first time, confusion clouding his face. "You look like Mommy," he whispered. Isabella's eyes filled with tears. "I know, but I'm not her, sweetheart. My name is Isabella." He tilted his head, studying her. Then, slowly, he climbed into her lap, the way children test trust not with words but with closeness. She held him gently, as though afraid he might vanish. That was the first night I saw Ethan laugh again. Michael noticed too. One evening, as Isabella sat on the floor helping Ethan piece together a puzzle, Michael leaned against the doorway, watching quietly. "She's good with him," he murmured. "Yes," I said. "She has a gentle heart." Michael's eyes were tired, but there was a glimmer of relief in them, a glimmer I hadn't seen since before the storm broke. Still, not everything healed quickly. There were nights when Ethan woke screaming, calling for his mother. I would rush to his side, gathering him in my arms, whispering, "It's all right, Grandma's here." Sometimes he asked questions I couldn't answer. Why didn't she want me? Did I do something wrong? And every time my heart shattered. I told him the same truth again and again, hoping repetition could stitch the wound. You did nothing wrong. Love failed you, but you never failed love. Michael struggled in his own way. He buried himself in work, often falling asleep at his drafting table. Once, late at night, I found him sitting in the living room, staring at his wedding photo. "Mom," he said hoarsely, "was I not enough?" I sat beside him, taking his hand. "You were more than enough. Her choices were never about you. Don't carry her sins as your burden." He wept then, quietly, like a boy who had lost his father all over again. I held him, just as I had years ago when Paul's casket lowered into the ground. Some things, it seems, never change. A mother's lap remains the last refuge, no matter how old her child. Weeks passed. Life reshaped itself in small, surprising ways. Isabella brought Ethan sketchbooks and taught him how to draw little birds. He called her Miss Bella at first, but one evening, after she sang him to sleep with a lullaby, he whispered, "Good night, Mom." She froze, tears sliding down her cheeks. I watched from the doorway, my own tears falling silently. Ethan had given her the title she never asked for, but perhaps had always deserved. I knew we were still broken. I knew scars would remain. But as I watched my grandson's small hand clutch Isabella's and my son finally sleep through the night without nightmares, I also knew this. Storms destroy, yes. But sometimes in the rubble we find seeds that were waiting to grow. And though Emily had left us with emptiness, Isabella's presence was slowly filling it with something new, something tender, unpolished, but real. It wasn't the life I had imagined, but it was life still. And for the sake of my son and grandson, I would water those seeds with every ounce of strength I had left. Spring drifted into summer, and with it came a gentleness I had once thought lost to us. The house, which for weeks had echoed with silence and sobs, slowly filled again with laughter, the small, bubbling kind that only a child can make. Ethan ran across the yard chasing butterflies, his giggles rising with the evening breeze. Isabella followed him with a sketchbook in hand, kneeling in the grass to show him how to capture wings with a pencil's stroke. From the porch, I watched them, my knitting resting in my lap, my heart both aching and at peace. Michael began to heal too, though in his own quiet way. At first, he buried himself in work, returning late and collapsing into bed without a word. But one evening, I found him in the yard, sitting beside Ethan as Isabella read aloud from a storybook. He wasn't sketching blueprints or answering emails. He was simply listening, the faintest smile tugging at his lips. Later that night, he admitted softly, "I thought love was gone forever, Mom, but maybe it just changes shape." I touched his hand and whispered, "Love doesn't die, Michael. It only waits to be rediscovered." Isabella never asked to be more than she was. She came with humility, helping where she could, never demanding. Yet, it was in the way she cooked soup when Michael had a cold, or how she tucked Ethan in with the same lullaby I once sang to my boys, that her presence wove itself into the fabric of our family. One evening, as she set a plate of food in front of Michael, he reached for her hand. His eyes were earnest, fragile, filled with gratitude. She blushed, startled, but did not pull away. From that night on, I saw something growing, quiet, tentative, but real. For Ethan, the change was gentler. Children have hearts like clay, soft, vulnerable, but capable of reshaping. He stopped asking why his mother had left. Instead, he began to ask, "Will Bella come to my soccer game? Or will Bella sing me that song again?" One night, as Isabella kissed his forehead, he whispered, "Good night, Mom." Her tears fell silently, but she smiled, and I knew a bond had been sealed, not by blood alone, but by choice, by love. As for me, I discovered something unexpected. All my life I had thought my role was to hold my family together with invisible threads, sacrificing my needs, silencing my doubts. But in facing the truth, in daring to name it, I realized my love was not just a quiet background melody. It was a force, fierce and unyielding, that could protect my son and grandson from lies, even when it broke me in the process. I am 50 now, a widow, a mother, a grandmother. And though I carry scars, I also carry hope, because storms, as I learned, are not the end of life. They are the winds that strip away what is false so that what is true might remain. One Sunday, as the sun set behind the maple trees, our family gathered in the yard. Michael grilled hamburgers, Ethan played catch with Daniel, who had flown in for the weekend, and Isabella laughed softly at their antics. I sat in my favorite chair, sipping tea, the sound of cicadas rising like a hymn. For the first time in a long while, I felt peace not because everything was perfect, but because we had survived. The woman who betrayed us was gone. The woman who stayed, unexpectedly, humbly, was the one who loved us. And the boy who once wept for 2 mothers now laughed freely, knowing he had more love than he could hold. I closed my eyes, whispering a silent prayer of gratitude to Paul. We made it, my love. Somehow, we made it. And now, dear listener, if you've stayed with me through this story, I want to thank you. This is Family Revenge Secrets, where the tales we share are not just about betrayal, but about the strength it takes to overcome it. I wish you health. I wish you peace. And most of all, I wish that your family, whatever shape it takes, becomes your greatest shelter. Hold them close. Forgive when you can. Protect what matters. Because in the end, family is the only thing that lasts. God bless you, and may love always find its way back to your home.